Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're headed over to the Philippines. There's been a lot of news lately about Typhoon Man-yi, and we're going to dig into all that. Our main source is this article from ABC News.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is actually like the sixth major storm to hit the Philippines in just a month. So even for a region that's, used to typhoon season,
Yeah.
this is unusual. It really makes you wonder if we're seeing the effects of climate change.
Yeah, that's definitely something that comes to mind, especially with Man-yi hitting so late in the typical typhoon season. It usually ends in October. But before we get into that bigger picture, let's talk about the impact of this storm. Tragically, there have been 8 confirmed deaths, including a family of 7 who were killed in a landslide.
Oh, wow, that's awful. It's just a reminder of the human cost of these events. And rescue teams are also still searching for another family that was swept away by floodwaters.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And on top of that, there's just the massive scale of the damage. Nearly 8,000 homes have been damaged or destroyed, and over 100 towns and cities are without power. Catanduanes Island seems to have been hit especially hard.
Yeah, that's where the typhoon first made landfall, right?
Exactly. And officials are saying the damage there is heavy. They're also saying that power could be out for months.
Wow, months.
Months! Can you imagine trying to rebuild your life without electricity for that long?
I can't even imagine. Even beyond just the immediate impact, that kind of long-term disruption makes recovery so difficult.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a reminder that the impact goes way beyond just the initial headlines. Speaking of which, the article mentioned 195-kilometer-per-hour winds. Those winds were strong enough to flatten homes and trigger those landslides we were talking about.
So,
This wasn't just a little rain.
no,
This was a force of nature.
right. Which brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier. Is this the new normal? Are we seeing climate change in the intensity of these storms?
It's a tough question. But I know scientists have been warning us for years that warmer ocean temperatures lead to more intense storms. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. It really comes down to the fact that warmer air holds more moisture. So as greenhouse gas emissions warm the planet and ocean temperatures rise, it leads to more evaporation, which means there's more moisture in the atmosphere. And that moisture basically acts as fuel for storms.
So it's not just that storms are potentially becoming more frequent, but they're also stronger because they're drawing on this larger reservoir of moisture.
Exactly. And all that moisture translates into heavier rainfall, stronger winds, and obviously a greater risk of flooding and damage. And this isn't limited to just typhoons in the Philippines either. We're seeing the same thing with hurricanes and cyclones and other extreme weather events around the world.
It makes you wonder if these recent events are just a preview of what's to come, especially with Man-yi hitting so late in typhoon season. And on top of that, there were 4 storms happening at the same time in the Pacific Basin.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's the first time that's happened since records began in 1951.
1951.
1951.
That's wild.
Yeah, the Japan Meteorological Agency called it completely unprecedented. It really makes you question our understanding of traditional weather patterns.
Totally.
You mentioned that scientists are connecting these stronger storms to climate change. What kind of evidence is there for that?
Well, there's a lot of evidence coming out. We can track the increase in global temperatures and then look at how that correlates with the intensity and frequency of extreme weather. So while it's hard to say for sure that any specific storm is caused by climate change, the overall trend is pretty undeniable.
It is a lot to think about. On one hand, we have this immediate devastation from the typhoon and the human toll. But then we also have these bigger questions about climate change and what that means for the future.
It's a complex picture, and I think that's why it's so important to really examine these issues, to understand all the factors at play, and to think about what we can do individually and collectively to address these challenges.
Right.
Yeah, it really is a lot. And speaking of collective action, the article mentions that the international community is really stepping up to help. The U.S., Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei have all pledged aid to the Philippines.
That's good to hear. It's good to see that there's a global recognition of how serious this is.
Definitely. These things go beyond national borders.
Yeah.
And it's encouraging to see countries coming together to help.
Yeah, for sure. The article also mentioned that U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with President Marcos recently. I know they were mainly focused on military stuff like intelligence sharing and weapons, but did they talk about the typhoon at all?
They did. Austin actually reassured President Marcos that the U.S. is there for them and that they'll provide additional aid for the recovery.
That's really great to see, especially since some would argue the U.S. has a big role to play in addressing climate change.
That's an important point to bring up. It's crucial to help with the immediate disaster relief. But we also need to be addressing those root causes of these increasingly severe weather events. And that's where global cooperation on climate action becomes so important.
Right. It does feel like there's a bit of a disconnect there sometimes. Countries are coming together to help with the aftermath of these disasters, but there's still so much work to do when it comes to actually preventing them in the first place.
It's definitely a complex issue, and it's easy to fall into the blame game. But what's clear is that we all have to do our part.
Definitely. While we're on the topic of recovery efforts, the article describes the scene in Balor. It's a coastal town that got hit pretty hard. Crews are working to clear all the debris and fallen trees and blocked roads and waterways.
It's a huge undertaking for sure. And it's the kind of thing that often goes unnoticed. The media attention fades, but these communities are left to deal with the aftermath. It can take months or even years to rebuild.
It's easy to forget about that long-term recovery process once the headlines disappear. And it's not just about the physical damage either.
Exactly. The trauma of losing your home and your belongings, or even loved ones, it can have such a profound impact. Recovery isn't just about rebuilding buildings. It's about supporting these communities in every way possible.
I think that's a really important point. So we've talked about the immediate impact of Typhoon Man-yi and the ongoing recovery efforts and this connection to climate change. What does it all mean for the listener? What are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think there are a few main things to consider. First, the human cost of these events is just undeniable. It's heartbreaking. Second, the connection between climate change and the increasing intensity of storms. It's becoming harder and harder to ignore. And third, we need a global response to this, both for disaster relief and climate action. This is a problem that affects us all.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive for me. It's devastating to see the destruction caused by Typhoon Man-yi, but it's also inspiring to see the resilience of the Filipino people and all the support they're getting from around the world.
It speaks volumes about the strength of the human spirit and the importance of coming together when these things happen. Even in the face of tragedy, there's still hope.
Absolutely. But it also raises a big question for me, and probably for our listeners too. What can we as individuals do to help? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these huge problems.
I understand that. But even small actions can make a difference. You can donate to relief organizations working in the Philippines. Reduce your own carbon footprint. Talk about these issues with your friends and family.
You mentioned reducing our carbon footprint. For anyone who might not be familiar with that term, can you explain what that means and how it ties into all of this?
Of course. Basically, your carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gases that you're responsible for releasing into the atmosphere. This comes from things like driving, using electricity, even the food you eat.
So by making changes to reduce our own personal impact, we can help to slow down climate change and hopefully lessen the severity of these extreme weather events.
Exactly. Our individual choices have a collective impact.
So it sounds like even small changes can add up to something meaningful.
They absolutely can. And it's not just about individual actions either. We need to advocate for bigger systemic change, policies that promote renewable energy and sustainable practices, and responsible environmental stewardship.
I like that. We can make changes in our own lives, but we also need to push for change on a larger scale.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're not powerless here. We can all do something. But at the same time, not everyone is equally equipped to deal with the impacts of climate change, are they?
You're right. Some communities are much more vulnerable than others. It depends on things like location, socioeconomic status, and access to resources. Like in the Philippines, those communities on Catandos Island, they're particularly susceptible to typhoons and rising sea levels. Yeah, that makes sense. And those who are already struggling financially, they often end up bearing the brunt of these disasters too.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on Typhoon Man-yi, it feels like we've uncovered these two interconnected stories. There's the immediate story of the storm itself, the damage, the loss of life, and the recovery. And then there's that bigger story of climate change and the role it plays in these events and this urgent need for global action.
I think you've summed it up perfectly. And while it can feel overwhelming, we have to remember that we can make a difference.
Exactly. So what can our listeners do to help?
Well, donating to organizations doing relief work in the Philippines is a great start. But it goes beyond that. Educate yourself about climate change. Make sustainable choices in your own life. Talk to your friends and family about these issues.
It's like you said earlier, those individual actions can have a ripple effect. If every listener took even one small step because of this deep dive, it could make a real difference.
I think so. We have more power than we realize sometimes.
That's a good point. So to wrap up this exploration of Typhoon Man-yi, and all the bigger issues it raises. We want to leave you with one final thought. How will you create your ripple?
How will you turn what we've talked about today into meaningful change? It's up to all of us to decide. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.